Hey guys, I'm Mountain Fiber, and in this video I'm going to share with you how I made a 1918 pleated plaid skirt. I was browsing through my local fabric store when I came across this lovely sort of blue, beige, black Glen check rayon twill, and I got a couple yards just, for the future. I didn't really have a project in mind, but I thought it was really pretty and it was very affordable. Fast forward to a couple weeks ago, and I found this pattern in Snow's skirt system, which is a pattern drafting instruction manual from 1918. It has everything that I love. It has pleating, it's made out of plaid, and it has this really interesting pocket detail, which I just go crazy for. It's the reason why I love 1910s fashion so much. And I figured the rayon would be the perfect choice for trying this out. Not too expensive, so I wasn't gonna waste or potentially ruin fabric that I'd spent a lot of money on, but also really pretty, and I wanted to wear something made out of it. This turned out to be not the best choice because it actually was sort of more of a polyester instead of a rayon, despite what it was sold as. So I kind of regretted that as I was working with it, but all's well that ends well. I love the end product, and I think it's really pretty. This is definitely more on the history bounding side of historical costuming, but I really love the process of taking authentic 1910s dressmaking techniques and modifying them slightly for 21st century purposes. Let's get into it. So the absolute first thing you need to do is take your waist and hip measurements. The hip measure is meant to be about 6 inches below the waist, depending on your torso length. I cut the fabric into 2 pieces of equal length, perpendicular to the selvage edge, then cut 2 narrow strips for the belt and 2 wider strips for the pockets. On the left side, I marked the placket opening with a pin about 8 inches down, then sewed together the side seams using French seams. The instructions tell you to start by marking the center of the center front panel and running a line of basting stitches about 6 inches down from the center front to mark the hip line. Here you can take into consideration whether or not you want the waistband of the skirt itself to be high or regulation, that is, falling at the natural waist. I chose regulation because I'm already quite high-waisted. I wanted to get as much of the skirt construction finished as I could before dealing with the pleating, so after this I moved on to making the placket. For the placket, I followed the same method outlined in the instruction booklet for the Vintage Pattern Lending Library 1918 skirt pattern. Basically, you cut 2 strips of facing fabric the length of the placket. One is about 1.5 inches wide, and the other is about 2.5 inches wide. With a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you pin and then sew the narrow strip right sides together along the front edge of the placket opening. Then turn under completely so that no facing is visible on the right side of the fabric. Press under the raw edge a 1/4 inch and top stitch the facing to the wrong side of the garment. Leave the top raw, since it's going to get finished along with the waistband, but fold in the bottom edge and top stitch it in place as I'm doing here. Then sew the wider facing right sides together to the back of the placket and fold in half. Fold the raw edge inwards a 1/4 inch and press. Then sew it down. This creates a little flap which goes behind the front of the placket, which should then lie flat. Should being the operative word here. Next came the pleating itself. The instructions recommend planning out the pleats, or as they call them, plaits, on the fabric itself, especially when working with a plaid. They also tell you how to do some pleat math, but frankly I ignored it, choosing instead to futz around with the pleats until they matched my waist measurement. I chose to do a box pleat at the center front of the skirt and an inverted box pleat at the center back, and pinned the pleats in place at both the waist and the hip. Then the instructions suggest you narrow the width of the pleats at the waist and widen the pleats at the hip, so that the skirt has a sort of slim, contoured fit from the waist down to the hip. I adjusted each pleat by about 1/4 inch in at the waist and 1/4 inch out at the hip. Then, following the reference image, I top-stitched 1/8 inch in along the edge of each of the pleats, stopping at the basted hip line. I trimmed away any uneven bits along the top and set about finishing the waistband with black cotton twill tape. I had some trouble deciding how I wanted to do the waistband, since typically in late teen skirts you fold over the raw edge of the waist and sew in a length of belting to form an interior waistband, which is ultimately what hugs your waist and keeps the skirt up. However, the pleats were super bulky in this fabric, and the goal of all waistband finishing, according to a very helpful 1917 dressmaking manual, is to reduce bulk in the waist by whatever means necessary. So I followed the manual's advice and finished it with a bit of tape whip-stitched on both sides over the raw edge. The author actually recommends satin ribbon, but, well, I didn't have any. Here is my most significant divergence from historical practice. I chose not to put in an interior waistband. This was practically unheard of during the late 1910s, but this skirt fits so close to my waist already that I just decided to forego it, since I really didn't need it, and if I do need it, I can always put it in later. I used hook and eye closures for the waistband and placket. Then I turned up the hem a ½ inch, pressed it, and turned it up 3/4 of an inch and pressed that too. The hem is another divergence from history, since this skirt is rather shorter than it should be, and the hem is quite narrow to preserve as much of the length as possible. 19-teens hems were typically quite deep, but I love the length of the skirt as is, since it feels a little bit more wearable for the 21st century. Now it's time for the belt. The belt in the illustration is extremely plain, but I couldn't resist adding some 1910s flair. I cut one strip of fabric slightly smaller than my waist measurement, and another strip of fabric to cover the gap with a few inches on either side to spare. I also cut out corresponding pieces of stiff cotton sateen as facings to give the belt a bit more structure. I wanted the front section to have pointed tips decorated with buttons, so I cut points at each end. I turned out the two belt sections, pressed them, and top-stitched 1/8 of an inch around the edges. Then I attached the back belt to the front belt on one side, leaving the left side open for hook and eye closures. I used beautiful vintage check glass buttons, which have a very interesting geometric pattern. And here's the finished belt. I drafted a pocket pattern based on my interpretation of the illustration in Snow's skirt system. Basically, it's just a rectangle with a pointed end. I allowed for a few inches at the top of the pocket in order to turn it under as a sort of facing, and I marked out seam allowances. Then I drafted one of the little straps, which will be used to decorate the pocket. I cut out the 2 pocket pieces and 4 straps, cutting an additional 4 black cotton facings for the straps. Originally, the end of the straps were meant to be round, like in the illustration, but then I realized that they would clash with the belt, so literally while sewing the first strap together, I changed the style to have a point at the end instead. I pressed over the edges of the pockets. As you can see, this fabric would not hold a press for the life of it. Then, slowly and messily, I pinned a strap to each side of the pocket. The illustration has them meeting in some indecipherable way in the middle of the pocket, but I chose to just overlap the straps as that seemed a lot simpler. This whole last section of the pocket construction was kind of a nightmare, but I'll take you through it anyway. I pinned the pockets in place, making sure that they caught an even number of pleats underneath them, and that the pleats weren't super wrinkled or out of order. I've never attached patch pockets to a pleated skirt before, and it was not easy. I top-stitched the pockets in place, securing the straps to the sides of each pocket in the process. Then I tacked down the straps one over the other and secured the decorative buttons in place. I had just finished the first pocket when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I forgot to top stitch around the straps.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
Anyway, I unpicked my tacking stitches and the buttons and top stitched around the straps. This was extremely difficult as they were already attached to a rather bulky skirt and really should have been done before they were even pinned to the pockets, but I managed. And I do think the end result is much nicer. So here's the skirt. It ended up being slightly flared since the fabric couldn't hold a pleat at the hem, more 1915 than 1918 in style. But overall, I think it looks lovely, it's super comfortable, and more flattering than I thought it would be. This is only my second ever 1910 skirt, and it was definitely daunting going in with only a basic drafting guide and a reference image, but somehow I managed to figure it out. I wish you guys luck in your sewing or crafting adventures, and hope to see you all in my next video. Thanks!